Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. This presentation is about Ghislaine Maxwell, the lady whom has had a long time working relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. We will take a look at her MSM biography, and then we will do a deeper dig on her and her family and find out who she really is. I'd also like to warn you, dear listeners, this presentation is going to have a lot of information, lots of connections will be made, and it's like a spider web. From Wikipedia. Ghislaine Maxwell was born in 1961 in France, the ninth and youngest child of Elizabeth Maynard, a French-born scholar, and Robert Maxwell, a Czechoslovakian-born British media proprietor. Her father was from a Jewish family and her mother was of Huguenot descent. Throughout childhood, Ghislaine resided with her family in Oxford at Headington Hill Hall, a 53-room mansion, where the offices of Pergamon Press, a publishing company run by Robert Maxwell, were also located. Maxwell attended Marlborough College and Balliol College in Oxford. Maxwell had an unusually close relationship with her father and was widely credited with being her father's favorite child. The Times reported that Robert Maxwell did not permit Ghislaine to bring her boyfriends home or to be seen with them publicly after she started attending Oxford University. And I'd like to comment here, knowing what we know about those who control the world and their pedo tendencies, this article says that she had an unusually close relationship with her father, and then an example that they give is that her father didn't allow her to bring boyfriends home or to be seen with them publicly once she started college, as if he were jealous. This seems very odd and out of place in this Wikipedia reference. Anyhow, since Wiki decided to speak about Robert Maxwell so much, so early into their description of Ghislaine, let us also do the same. From Wikipedia. Ian Robert Maxwell, born Jan Ludwig Hyman Benjamin Hack, June 10, 1923 to November 5, 1991, was a British media proprietor, member of Parliament, suspected spy, and fraudster. Originally from Czechoslovakia, Maxwell rose from poverty to build an extensive publishing empire. After his death, huge discrepancies in his company's finances were revealed, including his fraudulent misappropriation of the Mirror Group pension fund. Early in his life, Maxwell, an Orthodox Jew, escaped from Nazi occupation, joined the Czech army in exile during World War II, and was decorated after active service in the British Army. In subsequent years, he worked in publishing, building up Pergamon Press to a major publishing house. After 6 years as a Labour MP during the 1960s, Maxwell again put all his energy into business, successfully buying the British Printing Corporation, Mirror Group newspapers, and America's Macmillan Publishers, among other publishing companies. Now, let's go back to his credentials list. They first mentioned that he was a media proprietor. This is due to his extensive publishing empire. You see, according to Wiki, after the war, Maxwell used contacts in the Allied occupation authorities to go into business, becoming the British and U.S. distributor for Springer Verlag, a publisher of scientific books. In 1951, he bought 3/4 of Butterworth Springer, a minor publisher. The remaining quarter was held by the experienced scientific editor Paul Rosebod. They changed the name of the company to Pergamon Press and rapidly built it into a major publishing house. When one chooses to dig just a little bit deeper into Pergamon Press, we see that at first it was primarily a scientific publication, a publication that did stories on scientific findings in various scientists and researchers. It is at this time that Maxwell has been linked to Operation Paperclip, an Allied operation at the end of World War II where the Allied nations smuggled Nazi scientists out of Germany and into Western nations, mostly to the U.S., and were placed into government research departments and other government agencies like NASA, or I believe JPL at the time. Operation Paperclip was a secret program of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, or the JIOA, largely carried out by special agents of Army intelligence, in which more than 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians were taken from Germany to the United States for U.S. government employment, primarily between 1945 and 1959. Many were former members and some were former leaders of the Nazi Party. Many nations participated in this. In fact, it seems as though it was the Soviets who began doing this at first, and when the U.S. found out, they began their own program, doing the same thing. Mossad did it too. Here's an article from HamiltonHistoricalRecords.com. It says, in Egypt, the former Nazi scientists were utilized to develop long-range missiles for their wars against the Jewish state of Israel called Operation Damocles. And of course, Britain's MI6 also had their operation, although that op primarily worked in conjunction with the U.S. intel networks, Operation Paperclip. As the wiki stated, Maxwell was a suspected spy or intel asset. Some believe not a double or triple agent, but a quadruple agent. When one begins to dig a little bit deeper into Robert's personal beginnings with non-establishment sources, we find some very important information. From espionagehistoryarchive.com. The English lord changed names like pairs of gloves. He was neither Robert nor Maxwell, said Gennady Sokolov, a historian on intelligence who worked with the magnate at the end of the 1980s. He was born in 1923 in Czechoslovakia, in the Carpathian village of Slatino Selo, now the Ukrainian village of Solotvino. Abraham Lasby was the 9th child of Mikhail and Anne Hock's family. They lived in a small clay cottage with an earthen floor. When Hitler's forces occupied Czechoslovakia, the parents registered their son as Jan Ludwig Hock. From that time, he became a member of an underground organization that was illegally ferrying youth to France. He was arrested and sentenced to death, but the young man escaped. Through Serbia, Bulgaria, and Turkey, he reached Aleppo in Syria, then French territory. There, Jan joined the Foreign Legion. Soon after, he was sent with his group of legionnaires to France, where the lad took up a new name, now calling himself Ivan Dumarier. At this time, he participated in the French resistance movement and then the Allied landing at Normandy. Further on, fate landed him in Great Britain, and now Ivan became Leslie Johnson. The British recruited the young man into the intelligence services. Leslie was fluent in English, German, French, Czech, Slavic, Hungarian, Romanian, Russian, and Hebrew. When he received a combat decoration from the hands of Marshal Montgomery, he had changed his name for the 5th and last time to Robert Maxwell. Our hero finished the war as a captain. It was then that he contacted a representative of Soviet intelligence for the first time. It happened in the following manner. After the end of the war in 1945, Maxwell began searching out his relatives. Czechoslovakia at the time was in the Soviet occupation zone, and therefore he sought help from Soviet military authorities in Germany. And so, contact was established with emissaries of the USSR's NKVD. News about the fate of his parents was tragic. They died in Nazi concentration camps, but Soviet intelligence's relationship with Maxwell got its necessary development. We'll note that Maxwell has been christened one of the greatest spies of the Cold War. His record, however, isn't limited to work for Moscow. The main intelligence service in his life was Israel's Mossad. Yitzhak Shamir himself, the future prime minister of Israel, enrolled Jan Ludwig Haack into the Zionist underground organization Irgun at the beginning of World War II. There he received the agent call sign Little Czech, under which he worked his entire life. The French resistance and British army became the first phases of the Little Czech service in Zionist intelligence, well before the founding of the State of Israel and even Mossad. Further on, fate took its own turn, and Maxwell left the British Army in 1947, entering the publishing business. Moreover, after the war, Captain Maxwell had been the head of the British Foreign Office's press bureau in occupied Germany, where he made the needed connections. Having foreseen its importance in the modern world, the enterprising Maxwell made his bet on scientific information. This sphere became fertile ground for the intelligence services as well. After all, scientists and academics aspired to publish their works in his journals and released books under his label. The Little Czech's masters could find much of interest there. Maxwell published, for example, the Soviet physicist Lev Landau. Soon the publishing house became a leader in scientific technical literature as well as history, politics, and memoirs. Over the course of the 1980s, Maxwell's media empire encompassed 125 countries. He was known as a major publisher in Britain and held second place in the United States. Aside from newspapers, magazines, and books, he had a stake in radio stations and television channels, like MTV, for example. Competitors called him Hurricane Bob, and intelligence services other than Mossad called him Captain Bob. This enormous media empire became a cover for Captain Bob's espionage mission. It was a secret operation by Mossad, CIA, and MI6. The objective? Infiltrate a mole into the Kremlin. Captain Bob's masters organized such a legend for their agent that the USSR's leadership wouldn't entertain any doubt as to the billionaire's loyalty. Leonid Brezhnev immediately invited Maxwell to Moscow. The conversation took place one-on-one in Russian without interpreters or protocol. Much brought them together: past combat, a love of cars, hunting, and drinking. Robert became the General Secretary's friend, and they met regularly. Western intelligence analysts impatiently awaited reports on their discussions. CIA, MI6, and Mossad achieved their goal. Their man had gained entry into the Kremlin's halls of power. And so began a line of publications of Dear Leonid Ilyich works throughout the world. Brezhnev glorified in the praises his books received. After Brezhnev's death, Captain Bob developed contacts with new general secretaries, Andropov, Chernenko, and Gorbachev, and he remained the Kremlin's most important propagandist of the Soviet system abroad. The Central Committee's Agitprop, or the Ministry of Truth, generously paid for Maxwell's services from state coffers. Now, this was the KGB connection, and there's actually much more if you'd like to do some digging. With regard to the CIA, then we must also include Mossad, as most researchers now understand that at some point, and maybe since its inception, the CIA has been in partnership with Mossad, or maybe even controlled by Mossad, and others even claim that the CIA was created by the Mossad, of which is a whole separate dig on its own. Now, for those of you who've been paying attention for a very long time, the name of Ari Ben-Menashe will sound very familiar, because he is one of the names that kept popping up during the Reagan years as being involved in the Iran-Contra affair. In an interview, the independent outlet Narrative, reported on by the SGT report in December of 2019, Ben-Menashe, who himself was involved in Iran-Contra arm deals, told his interviewer, Zev Shalev, that he had been introduced to Jeffrey Epstein by Robert Maxwell in the mid-'80s, while Maxwell's and Ben Menash's involvement with Iran-Contra was ongoing. Ben Menash did not specify the year he met Epstein. Ben Menash told Shalev that he, Maxwell, wanted us to accept him, Epstein, as part of our group. I'm not denying that we were at that time a group, that it was Nick Davies, foreign editor of the Maxwell-owned Daily Mirror. It was Maxwell. It was myself and our team from Israel. We were doing what we were doing. Past reporting by Seymour Hersh and others revealed that Maxwell, Davies, and Ben Menash were involved in the transfer and sale of military equipment and weapons from Israel to Iran on behalf of Israeli intelligence during this time period. And again, if you followed all of that back in the 80s, you'll be aware that another name keeps popping up in conjunction with the Iran-Contra: Adnan Khashoggi. However, as Mint Press reported, Epstein was involved with several arms dealers during this time period, some of whom were directly involved in Iran-Contra arms deals between Israel and Iran. For instance, after leaving Bear Stearns in 1981, Epstein began working in the realms of shadow finance as a self-described, quote, financial bounty hunter, end quote, where he would both hunt down and hide money for powerful people. One of these powerful individuals was Adnan Khashoggi, a Saudi arms dealer with close ties to both Israel and U.S. intelligence, and one of the main brokers of Iran-Contra arms deals between Israel and Iran. Epstein would later forge a business relationship with a CIA front company involved in another aspect of Iran-Contra, the airline on behalf of Leslie Wexner's company, The Limited. Southern Air Transport had been proven to be a CIA front company, and it was one of the distribution companies for Wexner's Limited brands, or L brands, including his Victoria's Secret brand. Speaking of Saudi Arabia, remember the passport found in Epstein's safe? A finding first reported by journalist Edward Saul. When police recently discovered an Austrian passport with Epstein's picture and a fake name after raiding his Manhattan residence, the source and purpose of the passport came under media scrutiny. According to the Associated Press, Epstein's defense lawyers specifically argued that a friend gave it to him, Epstein, in the 1980s after some Jewish Americans were informally advised to carry identification bearing a non-Jewish name when traveling internationally during a period when hijackings were more common. If any of us would have been in court being asked why we had a passport from a different native country and a different current home country, we'd have been forced to name that friend that got it for us. But in this case, we plebs must instead discern for ourselves. The U.S. ambassador to Austria at the time, who would have overseen and signed off on this passport, was none other than the president of the World Jewish Congress and Mega Group member Ronald Lauder, CEO of Estee Lauder, appointed by Reagan and Mossad connected. What's the Mega Group, MEGA, rather than MAGA? Well, the Mega Group is a secretive group of Jewish billionaires formed in 1991 by Charles Bronfman and Leslie Wexner, the latter of whom has received considerable media scrutiny following the July arrest of his former protege Jeffrey Epstein last year, and the former is the Seagram's alcohol fame, Bronfman. Media profiles of the Mega Group painted as a, quote, loosely organized club of 20 of the nation's wealthiest and most influential Jewish businessmen, focused on philanthropy and, quote, Jewishness, with membership dues upwards of $30,000 per year. Yet several of its most prominent members have ties to organized crime. Mega Group members founded and/or are closely associated with some of the most well-known pro-Israel organizations. Other well-known groups associated with the mega group include the World Jewish Congress, as mentioned earlier, whose past president, Edgar Bronfman, and current president, Ronald Lauder, are both mega group members. And B'nai B'rith, particularly its spin-off known as the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL. The Bronfman brothers were major donors to the ADL, with Edgar serving as the ADL's honorary national vice chair for several years. And if you'll recall, it is the latter generations of the Bronfmans that are caught up in the NXIVM sex scandal. The ties between the mega group and national crime syndicates don't stop there. Another prominent member of the mega group with ties to a criminal mafia network is Max Fisher, who has been described as Wexner's mentor and is also alleged to have worked with Detroit's Purple Gang during Prohibition and beyond. Now, the Purple Gang were part of the network that smuggled Bronfman liquor from Canada into the United States during Prohibition. And one of its founders, Abe Bernstein, was a close associate of both Meyer Lansky and Mo Dalitz. Fisher was a key advisor to several U.S. presidents, beginning with Dwight D. Eisenhower, as well as to Henry Kissinger. And then, a side note, another member of the mega group is director Steven Spielberg. And I just thought you all should know that. Leslie, or Les Wexner, the other mega group co-founder, also has ties to organized crime. Wexner's ties to Jeffrey Epstein have come under scrutiny following the latter's arrest last year, as Wexner was the only publicly acknowledged client of Epstein's suspicious hedge fund, the source of much of his wealth, and the previous owner of Epstein's $56 million Manhattan townhouse, which Wexner transferred to an Epstein-controlled entity for free. Before Epstein received the townhouse, Wexner appears to have used the residence for some unconventional purposes, noted in a 1996 New York Times article on the then Wexner-owned residence, which included a, quote, bathroom reminiscent of James Bond movies, hidden beneath a stairway, lined with lead to provide shelter from attack, and supplied with closed-circuit television screens and a telephone, both concealed in a cabinet beneath the sink. The Times article does not speculate as to the purpose of this equipment. Of course they don't, though the allusion to famous fictionary super spy James Bond suggests that it may have been used to snoop on guests or conduct electronic surveillance. The 1996 Times article also noted that after Wexner bought the residence for $13.2 million in 1989, he spent millions more decorating and furnishing the home, including the addition of the electronic equipment in the James Bond bathroom, only to apparently never live in it. The Times, which interviewed Epstein for the piece, quoted him as saying that Les never spent more than 2 months there, and identified Epstein as Wexner's, quote, protege and one of his financial advisors, end quote, and that the house, by that time, already belonged to him, Epstein. The presence of the electronic equipment in his home's bathroom, other oddities related to the townhouse, and aspects of the links between Epstein and Wexner suggest there is more to Wexner, who has rather successfully developed a public image of a respectable businessman and philanthropist, much like other prominent members of the mega group. However, bits and pieces of Wexner's private secrets have occasionally bubbled up, only to be subjected to rapid cover-ups amidst concerns of, quote, libeling the powerful and well-connected billionaire's philanthropist. In 1985, Columbus, Ohio lawyer Arthur Shapiro was murdered in broad daylight at point-blank range in what was largely referred to as a mob-style murder. The homicide still remains unsolved, likely due to the fact that then Columbus Chief James Jackson ordered the destruction of key documents of its department's investigation into the murder. Though Jackson's efforts were meant to keep the libelous report far from public view, it was eventually obtained by Bob Fitrakis, attorney, journalist, and executive director of the Columbus Institute for Contemporary Journalism. after he was accidentally sent a copy of the report in 1998 as part of a public records request. The report, titled Shapiro Homicide Investigation, Analysis and Hypothesis, names Leslie Wexner as linked with associates reputed to be organized crime figures being involved in Shapiro's murder. The report also noted that Arthur Shapiro's law firm, Schwartz, Shapiro, Kelman, Warren, represented Wexner's company, The Limited, and states that prior to his death, Arthur Shapiro managed this account, The Limited, for the law firm. It also noted that at the time of his death, Shapiro was the subject of an investigation by the Internal Revenue Service because he had failed to file income tax returns for some 7 years prior to his death, and he had invested in some questionable tax shelters. It also stated that his death prevented Shapiro from his planned testimony at a grand jury hearing about these questionable tax shelters. As to Wexner's alleged links to organized crime, the report focuses on the close business relationship between Wexner's The Limited and a guy named Francis Walsh, whose trucking company had done in excess of 90% of The Limited's trucking business around the time of Shapiro's murder. According to the report, Walsh was named in a 1988 indictment as a co-conspirator of Genovese crime family boss Anthony Fat Tony Salerno. And the Shapiro murder report stated that Walsh was, quote, still considered associates of the Genovese La Rocca crime family, and Walsh was still providing truck transportation for The Limited at this time. Folks, Wexner and the mob were using that trucking company to run something around this country. And I'll tell you that Columbus, Ohio is still the city with the worst child trafficking numbers in the country. And this is the city that Wexner has long resided in. And P.S., he just stepped down as CEO of Limited Brands for some reason. Although it is claimed Wexner didn't become Epstein's client until 1987, there is, however, a 2001 interview with the Columbus Free Press. They report he began working for Wexner in 1985. And speaking of Epstein, this is the final player that must be spoken about. Let's start in 1981. In 1981, Epstein left Bear Stearns due to an insider trading investigation by the Securities and Exchange Commission involving Edgar Bronfman's Seagram's Corporation. Bronfman had advised investors and bankers of their impending offer to another company. Epstein left Bear Stearns one day after the SEC began the investigation. After leaving Bear Stearns, he told a few friends at the time that he had become a bounty hunter, working for the government or wealthy individuals recovering lost or stolen money, and that he was licensed to carry a firearm. The reality was a bit different, because this was exactly when the Iran-Contra operation was taking place, and it was at this very time Epstein claimed he was working for the CIA, something he later denied. One of his clients was Adnan Khashoggi, an Iran-Contra weapons dealer, a Saudi, and uncle of Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who was himself assassinated in later years. Adnan had procured a $5 million loan for Israel and Iran to do their parts in the Iran-Contra arms deals. Epstein was finding money all right, and he was doing it working for a bank that was a CIA front for funneling money. BCII, or the Bank of Credit and Commerce International. Khashoggi acted as the middleman for 5 Iranian arms dealers for the United States, financing a number of them through BCCI, and served as the banker for arms shipments as the undercover scheme developed. He also worked for the U.S. government in connection with the Iran-Contra affair and operations that involved the direct participation of CIA personnel banked at BCCI's offices in Monte Carlo. And for both BCCI's services were essential as a means of providing short-term credit for sales from the U.S. through Israel to Iran. And the Bank of Credit and Commerce International also engaged in Epstein's forte, something in which the CIA had been involved in for years with their mob connection. the trafficking of underage females for favors, and blackmail extortion. That's how Epstein found money. He was simply carrying out what the CIA had assigned for him. The CIA was under William Casey in those days, his tenure from 81 to 87. Now, keeping in mind Epstein had gotten an Australian passport in 1987 listing his residence in Saudi Arabia, Epstein was well acquainted with British arms dealer Sir Douglas Leese, who also had worked with Adnan Khashoggi in a bribery deal involving members of the Saudi royal family and Saudi officials, who were also tied to BCCI. It all comes together. And apparently that deal also involved Prince Charles, the later investigation of which was shuttered by Tony Blair and Prince Andrew. In 1982, Epstein began his own firm in Manhattan, J. Epstein & Company, managing individual and family fortunes of clients with $1 billion or more in assets. He would open additional branches in New Albany, Ohio, and in St. Thomas. Now, New Albany, Ohio is the outskirts of Columbus, where Les Wexner lives. Ladies and gentlemen, now that we have a little general history on these demons, let's glue this all together. Shortly after World War II, Robert Maxwell was recruited by the KGB while he was researching his family from Czechoslovakia. This is most likely the first time that Maxwell could be considered a double agent, as he was clearly a Mossad agent by that time. By 1951, Maxwell had set up his propaganda and front company called Springer Verlag, a scientific research publisher, eventually becoming Pergamon Press. This did two things for Maxwell. It allowed for a communist-friendly propaganda paper to be used in the West in order to create a different mindset with regard to Soviet and Nazi scientists. It also allowed for Maxwell to gain easy access to the Soviet regime. It also may be at this time that the CIA attained his services, because it is speculated that the CIA and MI6 used Maxwell and his access to Soviet contacts as a medium to more easily facilitate the paperclip operation. The mega group was founded by close friends and associates Les Wexner and Charles Bronfman. Charles Bronfman was a known business partner of Robert Maxwell, and also used Jeffrey Epstein as his personal banker when he worked at Bear Stearns and also at BCCI in the early 80s, as covered earlier in this presentation, when Epstein claimed that he was a money bounty hunter for the rich and powerful. It's not unreasonable to believe that Robert Maxwell also had a close relationship with Jeffrey Epstein at this time. Les Wexner bought and began renovating the mansion where Epstein eventually lived in 1989, and subsequently gave it to Epstein for free. The mansion was rigged with cameras and listening devices, and a bathroom was referred to as the James Bond room. Prior to the purchasing of the mansion and afterwards into the 90s, Epstein was living in homes near Wexner, like in New Albany, Ohio, before taking over full ownership of the Manhattan mansion. It is at this time, the late 80s, that it is believed that Robert Maxwell was handling Jeffrey Epstein for Les Wexner and other eventual founders of the mega group. Epstein began working for Wexner in 1985, of course with Wexner providing the funds to enrich Epstein and make him seem more important than he really was. In 1991, Maxwell is murdered, or committed suicide. Immediately after this, his daughter, Ghislaine, travels to the U.S., to New York, and immediately enters into some sort of relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. This is a cover story, just like the media description of her being a, quote, socialite. A socialite is defined as one prominent in fashionable society. A person, more often a woman, of social prominence, considered to be an influential figure, or a person who goes to fashionable parties and is often written about in the newspapers, etc. Remember after Robert Maxwell's death, the banks all called in his loans and the businesses all went bankrupt? I've never heard of a broke socialite. a socialite without any revenue streams. Ghislaine is an intel agency handler. It looks like that after the death of her father, she was dispatched, most likely by mobster Les Wexner, to New York to be the new handler for Jeffrey Epstein, giving him his orders, like Huma Abedin in HRC, or Hussein and Valerie Jarrett. Maybe the middle person who oversaw all of the blackmail videos, the audio files, the pictures, etc., facilitating the transfer of these things to Mossad and the mega group, demons. Also using her connections to lure other prominent, powerful men into the sphere of Mr. Epstein with the goal of blackmailing them too, giving the mega group even more power and control over world leaders. They set off on one of the greatest honeypot operations that the world has ever seen, ensnaring businessmen, CEOs, and powerful world leaders. When Ghislaine Maxwell goes down, she will bring down many, many more. She brings down many upper-level cabal players like Wexner, Lauder, the Bronfmans, the top-level overseers of the humongous global underage sex blackmail operation. And on the other side, she'll bring down the mid-level players partaking in this stuff, like many powerful, influential politicians, along with the Hollywood and music cabal establishment, like Will Smith, Kevin Spacey, Eminem, and Gwen Stefani. Ghislaine is the glue, folks. Let's all just hope that she makes it to trial. If you enjoyed this presentation, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.